What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are covering Fantastic Four #2, and this is cool because this is like the totality of Franklin Richards' powers in terms of like what he's fully capable of. And it's kind of interesting because Dan Slott takes an intriguing twist on the full abilities of Franklin, and we'll talk more about that as we sort of get through it. But this is kind of like the other half of Fantastic Four #1, right? Like Fantastic Four #1 dealt with like Johnny Storm and dealt with Ben Grimm and so on and so forth, and how they were dealing with the Fantastic Four being gone. And then this one shows us what was happening while they were doing that, but more so what the Fantastic Four have been doing this entire time. Now, for those of you guys who are kind of new to the whole Marvel Comics landscape and are picking up with Fantastic Four, essentially the multiverse was destroyed, right? Like we ended up basically learning that through a combination of an experiment with the Molecule Man Owen Reese and the Beyonders themselves, the idea was to destroy the entirety of the multiverse. And Dr. Doom had intervened. He had inadvertently eradicated a planet, and that eradicated Earth, and that destroyed the whole universe. And that led to like basically universes bumping into each other. It was called the Incursions. And where that was covered throughout the entirety of Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run, once we got to Secret Wars proper, basically it all kind of boiled down to a fight between Reed and Victor Von Doom. Sort of this fight that was a long time coming, when Dr. Doom finally had to admit that Reed was a better man than him. And then of course, once that was all said and done, Reed Richards restored everything back to normal. And so following that, the Fantastic Four went forward and just started creating universes. And that's what they've been doing the entire time. Now, if we're being honest with ourselves, Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars was basically setting the stage for a reboot. I mean, there's no way you can argue the opposite. Like it was a blank slate. And now universes are being made. Who knows what form they're going to take and who knows what's going to be there. And it was kind of weird. But the fact remains here that with the Fantastic Four going through, we don't really know about all the universes they've made. We just really pick up on one universe in particular. Now, Marvel is still following the numerical designation for universes, right? Like that was the old Captain Britain stories when they introduced Jim Jaspers, the Omniversal Development Court. Marvel wanted a way to be able to distinguish one universe from another. And so within the story by Alan Fine and Alan Moore, they said, well, the main Marvel universe is numerically designated as Earth 616, and that's how that whole thing was born. And so what we end up doing is picking up with like Valeria and Franklin. This is something that I want you guys to notice. They're a lot older. They're basically into their teenage years. You know, now, if I were a betting man, I'd say they're probably around the ages of like 15, 16 years old, somewhere along those lines, especially for Valeria, because she's at the age now where she's beginning to see boys in a different way. And so because of this, Valeria actually has the attention of a particular alien on this one world they've been creating, and Franklin's kind of giving her a hard time. But it's a cool little thing because this is actually a really, really smart move by Dan Slott to do this. Because when you're talking about someone like Valeria, by and large, ever since she really made her appearance in Marvel Comics back in the day, she's always just been the super genius daughter of Reed, right? Like that's why the Fantastic Four were always kind of like the center point of the comic book universe, is because Valeria is like the smartest person in the world. Marvel will kind of mess things around, they'll sort of shift things around and say, well, at any one point in time, depending on what the story calls for, either it's Franklin or Valeria or Victor Von Doom, that's like the smartest person in the world. But by and large, it's largely believed that Valeria is smarter than her father, especially being at such a young age and being equal to her dad, if not a little bit smarter. She'll certainly surpass him somewhere along the line. And so it's kind of a funny thing to have them grow up, because it means that you can start shifting stories in a different direction to where they kind of begin to start looking at life differently. They go through the adolescent phase that everybody else does. Now, Reed begins to pick up on what's going on. Reed begins to realize that his daughter is immensely infatuated with this alien on a different planet. And as any respectable father would do, he would say, not my daughter. So he snatches her up and they leave. That's not happening. Not a chance. And it's kind of a funny thing. You know, it's like, I know what those alien boys want. I know what they're looking for. They're not going to get it from my daughter. This kind of a protective father mentality there. But again, this goes into really kind of an explanation of how this whole thing works. And if anything, this is just kind of a refresher, you know, from Dan Slott, more so than establishing a new status quo. When it comes to Franklin and the Molecule Man, Franklin's powers are in a lot of ways untrained. He doesn't have total control over them. Now that's really left to like his older self when he's an adult. And to a degree, his adult self had traveled back to the past during Jonathan Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four and taught young Franklin how to harness his abilities, but only did it insofar as, here's how you hold your power. Here's how you collect your power. I'm going to need it at a future point in time, so don't really use any of it. And that's really all it was. But it was kind of taking Franklin on a tour and saying, this is what you're going to be capable of. You are a cosmic entity. The power you possess is absolutely insane. Now for Owen Reese, this is when things get a little hairy with regards to what Dan Slott's doing here. Owen Reese, he's really more more of a painter than the paint, if that makes any sense. Owen Reese has the ability to manipulate the universe, but he can't actually create a universe. That's not really something he can do. He's the Molecule Man, which is really kind of a misnomer. He's more akin to like the Atom Man, but Molecule Man sounds better. But he controls the atomic structure of matter. So imagine like Dr. Manhattan in the Marvel Universe, more or less, which inevitably is going to lead to comments. Who would win, Dr. Manhattan versus Owen Reese versus the Molecule Man? I have no idea. I have no clue, guys. Like put your hand over your eyes, grab a dart, and just throw it, and just whichever one it lands on is the one who would win. I have no earthly clue. But the fact remains here that Owen can't really create things unto himself. You know, he can't create something out of nothing. But Franklin Richards always had that ability. That was really established when he created like a pocket universe, both in terms of Hickman's Fantastic Four run, as well as the events of like Heroes Reborn. So we've seen him do that like a multitude of times. And so it's kind of weird because Owen basically makes the case that Franklin Richards can envision a universe, but Owen himself basically has to provide the molecules. And that's why this works. Because what this means is that Owen Reese, his power is so insane and it's so limitless that what he's basically doing here is he's using his own body for the most part and creating universes out of it. It's like removing a piece of himself and turning it into a universe that Franklin Richards envisions. So they're two halves of the same coin working in tandem in order to achieve a certain goal. On the surface, like, it's kind of funny because Dan Slott plays this off as just a thing that's being done. This is an insane level of power. This is Living Tribunal, the one above all levels of power. This is insane. Like that's why it's so crazy to see it just kind of be thrown out there as if it doesn't really matter, because it's just an enormous amount of ability. Either of these two guys, to give you guys perspective, either of these two guys could annihilate cosmic entities. It's crazy. Well, maybe not annihilate them, but certainly like challenge them and put up one hell of a fight. It's crazy, like the level of power that you see. And that's why whenever we have these discussions, you know, wherever we do these stories where you're talking about like cosmic entities and you're talking about immense levels of power, we really say that unless you have something to juxtapose it to, unless you have context, which is to say like Captain America fighting someone like this, or like Thanos without the Infinity Gauntlet fighting someone like this, you tend to kind of get lost in the extreme nature of what they're doing because there's nothing to really compare it to. It's just two guys who are basically gods creating universes. That's really kind of all you have to go on. And so it's really cool to see this happen because Franklin Richards, because it's his own imagination, what he envisions, Molecule Man creates. And so it's cool because he's created universes where almost all the planets are aquatic planets. He's created universes where they're all like cave-like planets. He's created all manner of different universes, envision them, and then in turn, Molecule Man makes them. Now, that's the other important reason for why Franklin is so powerful, is because Franklin's more of an architect. It's not like a child's mind creating insane things. You know, it's not like a child's imagination run wild. He's not like 4 or 5 anymore. If he was that young, these universes would be absolutely insane. It would be like the Infinity, and I don't know if it was the Infinity Revelation or whichever one it was that Jim Starlin wrote, where Thanos entered the mind of Adam Warlock and Adam Warlock entered the mind of Thanos. And Adam Warlock's mind was more of like completely structured and regimented, and there was no deviation. And Thanos's war was chaos and panic. It's a really interesting situation. And so it's kind of cool when it comes down to it, because it's crazy levels of power. Now, when it comes to Valeria, this is kind of a funny thing, is she's irritated because she can't talk to Aberos, the guy that she wants to talk to in that other universe. And this again kind of hits at the nature of how smart her character is, what she's capable of. And Franklin kind of makes a comment, well, maybe that's why Dad landed here, because he didn't want you talking to strange boys. Like he didn't he didn't want Valeria coming home one day saying, hey Dad, I'm leaving, I'm going to this universe over here because I found a boy I really like, and we're gonna go get married at the Chapel O' Love in Vegas, in that universe's version of Vegas. But in the middle of all this, when they basically set to creating their new universe, Franklin Richards' powers stopped working. Now, this is no small thing. What Reed does here is he sits down and he literally analyzes his son's powers. Like he analyzes them and says, look, your powers are still there. For whatever reason, you can't create universes anymore. Now, this in truth, at the outset, doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense, because when it, or I guess not really, I guess envision universes more or less, but like the ability to kind of take this concept, to take this universal energy, this cosmic energy, put it into a form, and then give it to Owen Reese, and then Owen Reese bringing it into existence. Franklin Richards can't do that anymore. And again, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense here, because Franklin Richards' powers were never compartmentalized, right? Like they were never divvied up. Like Franklin Richards has telepathy, but not telekinesis. Franklin Richards has reality warping, but not telepathy. His powers never worked that way. It was always just, he's wildly powerful. And like his powers will become insane, at some future point in time, and he'll basically become like God, more or less. He'll ascend to godhood and become a cosmic entity. What this is it's almost like saying Charles Xavier has telepathy, but he can't read minds. The two go hand in hand. You can't really separate one from the other. And so again, I mean, it kind of works for what Dan Slott's trying to achieve. It works for the purpose of the story in the sense that Franklin, this is kind of an indication there's a much larger force coming here. And while they're analyzing everything, they're basically beset by this being that just kind of smashes into the universe and then declares herself as a being called Griever. Now, this is Dan Slott basically creating a cosmic entity. And that's really the way this goes. And that's one of the things that's kind of funny, is people have a tendency to look at stories right now in Marvel Comics and say, okay, for the most part, the universe is fleshed out. And so you really can't create anything new because there's nothing new to create. And that's true to a degree, right? Like you really can't write new stories because pretty much every story that can be told has been told. All it would really boil down to is just retelling an older story by shifting up characters that are in it and just telling it a different way. Civil War II is a really good example of that. And so when you have this whole scenario unfolding, what we have to keep in mind here, for at least all the new folks anyway, what we have to remember here is that back in 1961, 1962, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee didn't create like a template for the universe and then say, okay, everyone go forward and tell your stories. It was just kind of, everybody was flying by the seat of their pants. And people like Roy Thomas and Steve Englehart and Steve Gerber and Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and Chris Claremont and all these writers, Dan Jurgens, all these people were just kind of making it up as they went along. They were just kind of creating these various entities and these various beings for the purpose of telling a particular story. And so this is how new cosmic entities are born. Now, whether or not any use is made out of them, time will only tell. I mean, that's really kind of the nature of things. Like you had Dan Slott created a cosmic entity in Silver Surfer, but she's never appeared since. She appeared in like The Ultimates by Al Ewing and then was never referenced again and probably never will be. But that's just kind of the nature of how these events unfold. And so it's kind of crazy because what she does here, the first thing this being does, the Griever does, is she shows up and she kills the Molecule Man. And again, this is not a small thing because while the Molecule Man isn't as powerful as he used to be, he's still insanely powerful. We've talked about his power already in terms of how it is now. Now, with regards to how his power is now, in terms of that discussion, I want you to keep that in mind because back in the late 1980s, the Molecule Man was way more powerful than that. I mean, the guy was like a multiversal constant. Like his power dwarfed the power of the Living Tribunal. I mean, it was insane. Like if you took Thanos with the Infinity Gauntlet and put him against old school Molecule Man from back in the day, oh, he would annihilate him. I mean, like Molecule Man would annihilate Thanos. It wouldn't even be a contest because it was stated time and time again that the Molecule Man's power was so extreme he could harness the very fundamental forces of the universe. And so he basically was like a walking, talking cosmic cube. He could manipulate time if his powers advanced to the point that he could, or if he learned how to unlock that ability. I mean, he could manipulate time, he could manipulate the space, he could manipulate the mind. I mean, the whole 9 yards. If it exists in a universe, he could control it. That's how powerful he was. The problem was that after Secret Wars 2, Marvel realized just how powerful he was, and it was almost impossible to write stories that basically amounted to God just deciding to fight the Fantastic Four one day. And so what we got was an unofficial Secret Wars 3 that was basically a kind of Fantastic Four like two-shot, and that went into Molecule Man's powers basically being reduced, giving us like the origin of him as being part of a cosmic cube and so on and so forth, and then his powers being reduced so that he wasn't really as capable as he used to be. And so if this was like old school Molecule Man from the late 1980s, no way this cosmic entity destroys him. But because this is the newer version who's weaker than he used to be, it's entirely possible. But it's still a pretty significant thing. We saw that in Al Ewing's Ultimates, right? Like when Galactus approaches the Molecule Man, Galactus is scared out of his wits because he's just like, this is a guy who could just annihilate me with a simple thought. I as Galactus, this insane being of immense power, could just be wiped away with what amounts to like a breath if the Molecule Man so chose to take me out like that. And so then you turn around and you have someone that powerful who's just annihilated in the blink of an eye, and that shows you the kind of power this being has. And so from there, the Fantastic Four do the only thing they can do, which is to flee as fast as they can. Because following this, all these different universes begin cracking and shattering and falling apart. It's kind of the collapse of the multiverse all over again. Now, this can be interpreted in a couple different ways. There are some who will look at this and say, okay, because of the power that the Griever wields, she's like the Marquis of Death, right? Just like waving her hand and destroying universes. But I would look at this and say, I don't think that's the case. Instead, what I would say here is that because all these universes were basically universes that were tied into the Molecule Man, because it was basically his own life energy, more or less, his own molecules that were creating these universes, when he was destroyed, those molecules went with it. And so it's like kicking the foundation out from under a building. Of course, it's going to come crashing down because the systems of support are no longer there. And so that's kind of how I would view this whole situation. But regardless of how you choose to view it, everything is crashing down again. Now, the way that Dan Slott writes Valeria here is actually a little strange, because what ends up happening is that where Reed and company say, look, we have to travel to like this one particular universe in order to, because it's the best anchored, and then from there there, formulate a plan, and figure out how to take this woman out, Valeria commandeers the ship and flies back over to where Abros is, to the boy that she likes, and then in turn is like, I did this essentially because of love, because she's in love with him, and because for her it's really more of an emotional decision. Historically speaking, and depending on how you view the Fantastic Four, for old school fans, they wouldn't like it any too much. And the reason why is because Valeria is essentially one of the 3 smartest people in the Marvel Universe. I would argue she's the smartest, but depending on what the story calls for, sometimes it's Doom, sometimes it's Reed Richards, so you can just kind of say she's one of the 3 smartest people in the entirety of the Marvel Universe, but she's governed by reason and logic. She doesn't really get emotional. It's one of the major traits of her character. Now, we can kind of chalk this up to Dan Slott saying, yeah, but like she's in her teenage years though. And as anybody will tell you, when you're a teenager, logic is the last thing that crosses your mind. You are emotional, your hormones are running wild, all those different things. And so it kind of makes sense that she would like fall prey to the natural biological evolution of human beings, and that her hormones will go crazy. She's in love with a boy and she wants to go see him. It kind of makes sense. And so what it does is it leads to the rest of the Fantastic Four, minus Franklin, forming a plan. Because Franklin's response is, I cannot believe you killed Owen Reese. I'm going to use every ounce of my power to annihilate you and to basically wipe you from the face of existence. And she just kind of flicks her finger, and that's the end of Franklin. Like, he just comes crashing down. He's not dead, but he just comes crashing down. He's basically crushed that fast and that easily by this person. Again, not a small thing. You're talking about a character who in the future will have power that's so extreme, he'll resurrect Galactus from the dead. It's mind-boggling when you think about this kind of thing in relation to like all the power that you see in Marvel. And so from here, it looks pretty wild in this whole scenario, because what she ends up doing is it's almost kind of, it's almost like she's a little cocky and a little arrogant, because Reed says like, ultimately we'll defeat you, we'll find a way to win, and that kind of a thing. And so she sort of gets carried away with herself. The Griever says, well then fine, here's a device. This is basically a multiversal transporter. This will transport you anywhere or transport anything here. And so it's just kind of like, flee, run, do whatever you want to do. But ultimately, I'm going to destroy everything, and I'm going to watch on, and I'm going to grieve as you and everyone in every universe you've ever cared about, that you've ever made, comes burning down around you. And so in response, Reed Richards, it really kind of picks up with like the tail end of Fantastic Four #1, where Reed is like assembling this device, basically getting this device together, putting it together, and then putting it to use, fires out a force signal to the main Marvel universe, and then teleports Johnny Storm, Ben Grimm to this planet he's on, alongside all the other extended family members of the Fantastic Four. And so the reason why this happened, this is kind of a funny thing, because at the outset when I saw this, I was like, oh my God, he just teleported all of Earth's superheroes to this world, and they're all going to fight this being. These are all people who have been part of the Future Foundation. The Ant-Man, Scott Lang, was part of the Future Foundation. You had Ben Grimm, of course, and you have Johnny Storm, who are part of the Fantastic Four, but you have like She-Hulk, who stood in for Ben Grimm at one point. That's actually kind of an interesting scenario. What Marvel did after the events of the original Secret Wars, the story was designed to kind of shake up the landscape. So 1984 comes around, Jim Shooter writes Secret Wars, Ben Grimm decides to stay behind because he had fallen in love with a woman on the planet he was on, and then when everything ended, I want to say she died or something like that, so he left the Fantastic Four team. And it was Marvel's way of bringing in She-Hulk and trying to make her relevant by having her be a stand-in for Ben Grimm, and it worked incredibly well. It was actually some pretty damn good storytelling when it came to her being part of the Fantastic Four. That's also one of the things that segued into John Byrne's run and made John Byrne's run. I'm pretty sure John Byrne's run was after Secret Wars. Peter Parker tried to join the Fantastic Four in the first in Amazing Spider-Man #1. He was turned down and then eventually became part of the Future Foundation. T'Challa, like all these characters, all these people in some form or fashion have been a member of the Fantastic Four community. Now, it's not the most powerful beings there, because the Fantastic Four were never about being powerhouses. They were never about being like the X-Men, right? Where it's just like, we have godly, powerful characters here that are just going to sit in the house all day long and read people's minds like weirdos. It was never like that. It was more of like explorers. It was more of getting out there and exploring things and seeing what the universe was about. So that's why you don't see people here like Magneto. That's why you don't see people here like Matthew Malloy somehow resurrected from the dead, or you don't see like, these insanely powerful beings. Galactus, you don't see him here. You don't see the Silver Surfer, because it's basically just like people who have been part of the Fantastic Four team. But it's a cool thing, because now everyone is for the most part aware the Fantastic Four are alive, that Reed Richards, Susan Storm, Ben Grimm, that they're all basically alive here. They're continuing on their escapades. And so at this point, it's only a matter of time before they make their return. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.